Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's event with the title Brothers in Arms, the Value of Coalitions in Sanction Regimes. I am Mahdi Gotsi. I'm an economist from the Vienna Institute for International Economic Studies. And today's presenter is Joschka Vane from University of Potsdam. And this event is part of the series of seminars in international economics, which are organized jointly by the Vienna Institute for International Economic Studies and the Research Center International Economics, or FIW. And these seminars in international economics are intended to be a forum for presentation of the current research findings in the field of international economics, or more specifically, international trade, foreign direct investment, and international migration. And to give you some information about the event today and the housekeeping rules, we usually have 30 to 40 minutes of presentation, which will be followed by a discussion in a Q&A session at the end, which will last about 20 minutes. So you will have the chance and opportunity to ask your questions in the chat. And if the question is pressing, I also ask you to unmute yourself to ask your question, because that might help the understanding of us and also your own understanding. But if you don't want to unmute yourself, if I read your question and if it is important, I will ask it right away. But otherwise, at the end, we will collect all questions, and I would like to ask you at the end to unmute yourself and raise your comment and ask your question. And after the event, we usually send online surveys so that we can get the feedback from you, so that we can improve the seminars in the future as well. And it's an important note that this event today will be recorded, and we will post it online on our wiiw YouTube channel, so that those who missed this talk can listen to it afterwards. And also, Joschka agreed that he gave us the slides, and he agreed that we will be able to upload the slides on the wiiw website. Actually, I think they are already there. So if you want the slides at the same time that Joschka is presenting, please do download the slides right now. And in order to introduce Joschka, well, actually, I know Joschka through several conferences and research events that we both attended. Joschka is right now assistant professor of quantitative economics at University of Potsdam, or he's a faculty member at Berlin School of Economics. And he's also an external researcher at Kiel Institute for the World Economy. And he works extensively on international trade and empirical economics on international trade and trade policy. He uses gravity model a lot, so he publishes a lot on gravity models. He works also on environmental issues related to trade, and he publishes on that as well. And he also works on the effects of sanctions on trade, and as well as firm-level exporting behavior related to sanctions. His work has been published in Journal of International Economics, European Economic Review, Ecological Economics, and many other journals with many citations. So Joschka, thanks a lot for accepting the invitation today, and it's a pleasure to have you here. And the topic is very interesting for us, for many people in the world, for Europe. And we want to know how sanctions affect targeted countries like Russia, like Iran. So it's a very great opportunity for us to hear your extensive technical analysis on the topic. So thanks a lot for being with us. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Madi, for those kind words. Thanks for having me. It's all my pleasure to be here online with you today. And I'm looking forward to presenting joint work with three co-authors who are also all affiliated with the Kiel Institute, at least among others. So Sonali Chowdhury, Julian Hinz, and Katrin Kamin. And the paper is called Brothers in Arms, the Value of Coalitions and Sanctions Regimes. So very specifically, we will want to learn something about how coalitions or the composition of coalitions affect sanctions differently from countries acting on their own in a unilateral way. And we're going to look at these questions in the context of two sanctions episodes, two prominent ones, the 2012 Iran sanctions and the 2014 Russia sanctions. At some point, there's probably an obvious kind of spin-off paper to this where we analyze the current sanctions episodes, but so far for today you will have to bear with me that it's the older round of sanctions rather. So let me motivate what we're doing with a few newspaper headlines. First one is on Chinese reactions. So China watches worriedly as Ukraine makes US, EU, and Japan strengthen their alliance. So quite maybe to the opposite of what Russia had expected. What happened in response to the war last year was that the Western alliance really kind of moved closer together. And you can see that at different places. One of them is exactly the sanctions packages where many countries actually jointly agreed on a set of sanctions that were put in place against Russia, which is something that we've seen before in other Russian and also Iranian cases. And China was kind of watching that from the outside. And actually then the coalitions of those countries that took action against Russia, they really started to put pressure on China to also kind of act vis-a-vis Russia and oppose the Russian war. This is not a Chinese special case. Similarly, the coalition put pressure on India to condemn Russia and not to kind of give Russia attractive outside options. And we don't even have to go as far as India and China. We can stay within Europe, where Switzerland, even though they're not part of the EU and this traditionally neutral country, at some point they felt sufficiently pressured by the alliance, by the coalition, to also adopt sanctions vis-a-vis Russia. Now, the question we want to look at in this paper on a very general level is what's the economic cost of using sanctions to pursue geopolitical objectives. Sanctions, of course, are a costly tool because they introduce additional frictions, and quantifying those effects of sanctions per se is a non-trivial task, because we are in a globally integrated economy where we're not only buying like some final products from other countries, but we have global value chains where products go back and forth between countries, and therefore quantifying the effect of sanctions is not super straightforward, and we need to have a model to do that that allows us to kind of track those value chains. And then we want to look at both sides of those costs. So we want to look at the costs that are incurred by the countries that actually put in place sanctions. Okay, so I mean, the idea of the Western alliance putting in place sanctions is obviously not to hurt themselves, but to hurt Russia. But they cannot do so without a cost. So we want to know how high is the cost for the sanctioning countries, and of course we also want to know how large are the costs that are imposed on the target country, which countries have a particularly good or bad ratio between the two, right? Ideally, I want to inflict large costs at the same time, incur low costs myself, and we want to look at that across countries in the actual coalition and beyond. So as I already mentioned, the way we do this, we do it in the setting of the 2012 Iran and the 2014 Russia sanctions. So sanction episodes that have taken place, so that we can, in a first step, try and quantify the effect of those sanctions on trade costs, and then in a second step, put those those trade cost estimates into a model so that we can simulate the overall welfare effects. And we're going to do that, first of all, for the actual coalition. So we really want to learn, okay, what's our estimate for how badly were Russia and Iran affected by the sanctions that were actually put in place? But then we're also going to change things. We're going to say, what happens if we take individual countries out? What happens if we add individual countries? What countries would inflict large potential harm beyond the actual coalition, etc. And whenever I talk about these costs, what I mean is aggregate welfare changes. And as is pretty common in trade models, aggregate welfare changes is nothing else than real income changes. And Madi mentioned the gravity context of most of my work. So this is going to be heavily gravity related, actually in a double sense. So we say we make the dual use of gravity in this context, because we're going to use gravity both as an estimation tool. So in the kind of Anderson van Wynkoop way of estimating trade cost determinants using a structural gravity equation, and we're going to use it as a quantitative trade theory tool. So to do the general equilibrium simulations to see what do these different bilateral trade cost shocks then ultimately end up doing to the global economy and to the countries they're in. There are two smaller methodological contributions in the paper. One is on the econometric side, where we introduce a Bayesian bootstrap procedure to the gravity estimation, because we know there's an incidental parameter problem with the standard errors in three-way gravity estimation. And we think the bootstrap is a nice way of introducing standard errors in a way that we can then transfer to the general equilibrium setting so that we get confidence intervals both for the estimates in the first step and for the simulation in the second step, but I'll say a little more about that later. And in terms of the model is going to be mostly completely taken off the shelf. It's going to be a Caliendo-Paro type of Ricardian trade model. But we add one bit there, which is a notion of transfers that are introduced in such a way that they introduce like a burden sharing mechanism within the coalition. So we will have transfers that equalize the welfare loss of the coalition members. Okay, so that's kind of what is coming up in the next 20 minutes or so. Let me start by talking a little bit about the model, but I'm not going to go through the formal details because, as I said, it's Caliendo-Paro. So what does that mean? It's a Ricardian trade model. So trade is based on technological differences and comparative advantage. Obviously, it's a multi-country model. We want to talk about different country coalitions and the effects on international trade. It's also a multi-sector model, so we can look at whether sanctions affect different sectors in different ways. And then there are those input-output linkages that relate to the point I made earlier, that we want to be able to capture the effect on global value chains. Okay, and therefore, different sectors can be differently affected in terms of their trade cost effect, and they can have different effects on the economy depending on where they tend to be located in the value chain. Production is fairly simple, just one factor, which is labor, and then there's a composite of intermediates, which comes from the other sectors. Preferences are Cobb-Douglas across sectors, therefore there are constant expenditure shares across sectors, and then the CES utility, so a lot of variety within each of the sectors, and within each of the sectors there's a unit interval continuum of goods in the usual Ricardian Eaton-Gordon type of way. Now, one important feature of this Caliendo-Paro type framework is that on each sectoral level, for any given sector you can take out, the trade flows, the bilateral trade flows in a given sector follow a structural gravity equation. Okay, and we're gonna make use of this feature of this prominent quantitative trade framework that nested within it is a gravity relationship that we can use in the estimation step of the paper. Okay, now the way we typically see Caliendo-Paro being used is as a general equilibrium model. So that's the key strength of the framework, is that you can use it to compute general equilibrium adjustments to trade cost shocks. Okay, so Caliendo-Paro originally in their paper, they look at NAFTA, they look at tariff changes induced by NAFTA, and then they see, okay, what happens to trade, what happens to welfare, what happens to prices, etc. But because it nests this sector level structural gravity equation, we're gonna do both. So we're gonna use the gravity equation on the sectoral level for the estimation of what's the extent of the trade cost shock induced by the sanctions, and then once we've got an estimate for how much trade costs increase due to the sanctions, we put this estimate into the simulation and we get the general equilibrium results. We do so following this so-called exact head algebra introduced by Dickel, Eaton, and Kortum, which means we don't have to identify all the parameters of the model, and which also importantly means that things are way faster if you want to solve the model, which is important because, as you will see, we do a very large number of simulations, so speed is actually a relevant category here. And then there's the one model extension that I mentioned, which is a transfer mechanism. So the idea behind this extension is the question, what net transfer is necessary to balance impact for all coalition members? Okay, so we will see that coalition members that put in place sanctions, they are hit by that themselves. They lose welfare to a certain extent, and they will lose welfare to very different extents, depending on their relationship with the sanctioned country and also on their economic size. And what our extension is going to do, it's going to endogenously determine which amount would any country of the coalition need to either pay into a common pool of transfers or receive out of this common pool, so that after anyone has received and paid their transfers, all the coalition countries, they lose welfare to a certain extent, but they all lose so exactly to the same percentage. Okay, we're gonna bring things to the data based on 3 sources. GTAP10 is going to be the key ingredient for the general equilibrium model. So we need to have the sectoral expenditure shares, we need to have the IO structure. All of that comes out of GTAP. We combine it with trade flows from UN Comtrade for a 20 years span from 2000 to 2019, so that we have the 2 sanctions periods within there, and then we add some CP gravity control variables to that. Okay. So I said we have the 2 steps. We have first using gravity for estimation, and then using this specific Caliendo-Paro version of a gravity model for simulation. And I'm going to take you first through the gravity estimation. So conveniently, we know that that gravity has this separability notion that we can actually take trade flows apart sector by sector and then apply the usual gravity estimation steps that we know, or the usual procedure on a sectoral level. So that's exactly what we do. We aggregate the UN Comtrade data to the 65 GTAP sectors, because that's the one for which we know the IO structure later on. And then for each of the 65 sectors, we estimate this kind of specification where we have bilateral trade flows from O to D, origin to destination in period T, 3 sets of fixed effects, OT, so origin time, destination time. Those are the ones that take care of economic size as well as, importantly, of multilateral resistance. The country pair fixed effects try to account for some indigeneity concerns, and then all that is left, for which we can actually estimate a structural parameter, are the bilateral time varying variables, where we put in RTA, WTO, some standard variables, but then importantly, the key variables will be four dummy variables for the sanctions episode. So is it a trade flow during a sanction episode from a sanctioning country to Iran or to Russia, and the other way around? Is it a trade flow from Russia or from Iran to one of the sanctioning countries during the sanction episode? So those will be the key sanctions variables that enter into this Z vector, and for which we estimate the corresponding betas that will inform us about how strong actually was the trade effect of those sanctions that were implemented. We estimate that as a standard with Poisson pseudo maximum likelihood. And then once we have an estimate for the beta, specifically for those different sanction betas, we can translate that using the trade elasticity, for which we have external estimates. We can translate that estimate for beta into an estimated change of the trade cost. Okay, so on a sectoral level, we can determine by which percentage did the trade costs between sanctioning countries and Iran or Russia increase in reaction to the sanctions.
One question that I have, Yoshka, is the reason that you don't estimate it on all sectors within the same sample is because if you do that, you would need, instead of OT, you would need O sector T, right? And then the sanction variables would drop out. Or the other D sector T, then with D sector T, the sanction would drop out. So that's why you estimate it only for each sector separately. Right?
No, so if we were to do it in one step, what we would need would be OT sector, DT sector.
Right.
And then for the other one, we could discuss. So you would probably want to have OD sector, but all of that would still be fine. In principle, in terms of the fixed effects, what we could do then would be origin destination time. That's something we would not want to do, because then we would no longer be able to identify the dummy. But otherwise, I don't think we couldn't do it. I just don't think we're gonna gain a lot from that. So it would make the regression very large. And then the variation that is used in large parts is kind of separated by the fixed effects anyways, right? So I think the only thing you could gain would be like some, in my expectation, rather minor efficiency gains.
Okay.
But I think technically we could.
Okay, thank you.
One additional way in which it would help would be in the clustering, in the sense that we could allow an additional source of correlation in the error, but that's something that our bootstrap already captures, as I'm going to explain right now. So I said there is a small econometric contribution in the paper, which is related to the standard errors. So in this three-way gravity setting, three-way fixed effects with Poisson, we know that the standard errors of a typical cluster, like a typical clustered standard errors that allows for serial correlation, is actually downward biased. Now, there is a bias correction out there that you can use. The alternative that has been suggested is a bootstrap. Now, the bootstrap, as one would typically do it, would be to like draw country pairs and then put them back and redraw, so that some country pairs are drawn multiple times, some country pairs are never drawn, which in principle is fine in the gravity setting. However, this means that you're kind of changing the structure of the sample with every draw, and therefore you could run into collinearity issue for some fixed effects that you could identify on the full sample, but no longer on the bootstrap sample. So what we're suggesting to do is instead is a Bayesian bootstrap, which rather than giving integer weights to all the observations, it gives any observation a non-zero weight between 0 and 1. And therefore it leaves this overall kind of world trade matrix structure unaffected in every iteration of the bootstrap. And because we're already bootstrapping in the estimation, we think, a fairly natural way of extending inference to the GE setting, because then we just take the bootstrap from the estimation, and then for any point estimate from the estimation, we run the simulation, so that we get a range of counterfactual results. And while we estimate sectors separately, one after another, we keep the same Bayesian bootstrap weights for any given iteration across sectors, and therefore we allow correlation in the error term across sectors in the estimation stage, which then transfers into the counterfactual simulation. So we should, in our view, be on the more conservative side than if you do it with separate weights for any sector. Okay, I'm not going to show you all the estimation results, because, as I said, we do that sector by sector, and there are 65 sectors, so that's not very tractable. So what I show you instead are the aggregate results, which are more for illustrational purposes and which are reassuring, because they show we really see there are strong negative effects on trade flows between the sanctioning countries and Iran and Russia in the two sanction episodes, and in both directions, actually. So both exports to Iran and imports from Iran. For Russia, I have to add that, of course, some of the flows are actually affected by Russian counter-sanctions, mainly in agriculture, and we're not able to distinguish the two. So this is kind of a joint estimate of the effects of sanctions and counter-sanctions. Probably most of it is the sanctions, because Russian counter-sanctions were pretty focused on some agricultural products, but I'm just making clear that there's no way that our dummy-based specification is able to distinguish the two. Okay.
So, sorry, so the previous table, it was for the aggregate trade. It was not by
exactly.
each
So
sector.
that's aggregate. That's not what goes into the simulation. Into the simulation, we enter the sector level.
But you have estimates at the sector level, and maybe you can also present a similar thing using the averages of the beta coefficients, right?
That's true. That's actually a good idea.
And then maybe the joint significance of all coefficients.
Yeah. So my guess would be that it's kind of a sector size weighted average of this is a sector size weighted average of our sectoral betas, I would guess, but we should check. Yeah. Okay, now armed with those estimates, we go into the second stage, so into the simulations, and there we have 5 different kind of scenarios we look at. First some benchmarks. So what was the actual sanction effect, and what would they have looked like if it had been a global coalition and if it had been an embargo rather than just some sanctions? Then we're going to look at the individual countries. We have something on China and something on adding more countries beyond the actual coalition. I'm not going to talk about those two today in the interest of time. And then I'm going to show you the results related to this burden sharing mechanism that I mentioned earlier in the model context. Okay, so let's first establish the benchmarks. So if we look at panel A here, the actual coalitions implemented versus Iran by the actual coalition, we estimate that it hit Iran by 1.5%. So kind of a mild recession induced by the sanctions. You see that even though it's counterfactual results, there's a number in parentheses below. So there is a standard error to this because we applied the bootstrap also in the simulation step. Now, we could say, okay, what if the same measures, so the same trade cost shocks, had been implemented not just by those countries, but by the whole world? And we see that, okay, this would have amplified the effect on Iran. Alternatively, the same set of countries could have taken stronger action, namely they could have said, we're not going to trade with Iran anymore whatsoever. That's the most extreme stand they can take. That's kind of the most harm they can do via economic sanctions directly. And what we find is then, okay, in this case, they would have achieved a 4% welfare loss in Iran. And then we can combine those two dimensions. What if the whole world, except Iran themselves, and had taken the strongest action they could, namely a complete embargo, then we end up with those 13%. So this is equivalent to asking what's the overall gains from trade for Iran. And the overall gains from trade is kind of a maximum number of what you can make the targeted country lose if you impose the strictest sanctions possible. And we follow the same steps for Russia, and the pattern is very similar. The key number, once again, maybe is the actual coalition with the actual measure. So we find an estimate of 1.7%. So Russia was pretty severely hit by the 2014 sanctions, according to our quantification. Okay, so those are the benchmarks that we see, like how far did the coalition go in terms of the overall potential of affecting those countries they were trying to hurt. Okay, now in the first group of scenarios, we look at the incurred and imposed economic costs across a member. So what's the imposed cost? So the cost inflicted on the targeted country if a certain country puts those sanctions in place unilaterally, so they act on their own, or in comparison, if the same country joins a coalition that is already there, just lacking this one country so far. Okay, so we have say the EU plus US as a coalition, but Germany is missing. We add Germany, we see how much additional harm does that put on Russia, and compare that to no one is targeting Russia except Germany. What's the harm they can do? And we do exactly the same thing on the domestic cost side. How costly is it for Germany to sanction Russia if they do it on their own, in comparison to how costly is it if they are joining this overall large coalition? And we're going to look at Iran first. On the left, we have the domestic welfare losses incurred by the sanctioning countries. On the right, we have the welfare change induced by those countries in Iran. First of all, looking at the axis, we see that domestic costs are way smaller than the costs inflicted on Iran. That's because Iran is not a huge economy in comparison, at least, to some of the sanctioning countries. If we look at who's most affected at home, it's South Korea, Turkey, and Greece. if we look at who can put the largest harm on Iran, it's again Turkey, South Korea, and then we have, maybe not so surprising, some of the largest economies, so Japan, United States, Germany. By their sheer size, they are able to hurt the sanctioned country. And then, as you have noticed, there are like many points for every country. They come out of the bootstrap, so this indicates that there is uncertainty on how large those numbers exactly are. So we show those box plots, and you see that there's always two colors: the green one and the purple one. Green refers to the unilateral case, so the country acting on their own. Purple refers to the multilateral case, so to adding this country to the full coalition except the one country. And what we see in terms of the welfare loss incurred is that the multilateral distribution is always shifted a little bit to the right, meaning the numbers are similar, but it's always the case that if I join the coalition, this affects my welfare somewhat less than if I do this on my own. And the opposite is true if we look at the harm done to the sanctioned country. There, the purple distribution is always shifted somewhat to the left, meaning that I can hurt the country to a certain extent on my own, but if I do exactly the same thing on top of the rest of the world or the rest of the coalition already doing this, my addition is going to be larger than if I did it on my own. Okay, so in both dimensions, inflicted pain and pain taken myself, we get kind of the direction we want if we do it in a joint effort rather than on our own. So less domestic costs, higher costs in the targeted country. This pattern is exactly also there.
Sorry, one question, Yoshka.
Yeah.
In the previous, this one.
Mm-hmm.
So do I see it correctly that for Malta, the incurred cost is, the incurred welfare loss is positive?
Yes. So not significantly so. So it could be zero, but if anything, it should be somewhat positive. Now you're going to ask me why, right?
How could it be explained? So is it like instead of Iran, they export it somewhere else and then they benefit more? Oh.
Exactly. So there is going to be trade diversion going on, right? So if you're not part of the coalition, it's clear that you're gonna gain, right? So countries make their trade with some country more expensive. That makes them more open towards other trading partners, right? So we don't change our absolute trade cost, but relatively we become more attractive to one another if I'm moving away from someone else. Therefore, for outsiders, via trade diversion, we're expecting that they gain somewhat. Now, Malta is not an outsider, so we would not expect it. But then if Malta is trading extremely little with Iran to begin with, or if the sanctions only hit sectors in which they happen not to trade with Iran to begin with, then this could still arise.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a bit of an odd one out, but I think we, with the trade diversion channel, we can explain it. But I have not looked in detail into the Malta-Iran trade pattern. This should hopefully line up with the story I just told. Okay, so that's the same two pictures for Russia rather than Iran. Good thing, the relative positioning of green and purple is going to be the same as before. So again, I'm less hit myself if I do it as part of the group. I hit Russia more if I do it as part of the group. If, however, we look at the axis, now we see that, I mean, the largest pain that any country can put on Russia is Germany, with the sanctions, with a welfare cost of around 0.3%. If, on the other hand, we look at the largest cost that anyone incurs due to targeting Russia, we see that like the average effect for Lithuania is around 0.8%. Okay, so now we have Russia, which is this kind of key trading partner for some of the smaller Eastern European economies. If they try to hit Russia, they are really hitting themselves quite badly. Okay, so here it's no longer for every country that, okay, they incur a cost, but at least they are hurting the targeted country more than themselves. Here it's really, for some countries, it's a very costly exercise, while at the same time, if we look for Lithuania here on the right, we see that the damage they put on Russia is only like 0.05%. So for every dollar they make Russia pay, they pay several dollars more. Okay, so this comparison of acting unilaterally versus acting multilaterally, that's kind of summarized here in those tables. I don't go into it in detail, but on average, domestic welfare loss is almost 10% smaller if I'm part of the group rather than on my own. Welfare losses in the target country are on average 4.5% larger in Iran and 9.3% larger in Russia if I'm joining the group rather than doing it myself. Okay, now, as I said, I want to talk about one last scenario, which is the fourth one we look at, which is the burden sharing one. And first, again, we're going to look at the Iran sanctions. On the left, we have absolute transfers in million US dollar. On the right, we have them relative to GDP. And now all the countries that experience a domestic welfare loss that is smaller than average when hitting Iran with the sanctions, they will pay into the pool. They will pay into the pool to kind of counteract the strong losses that some other countries are incurring. We saw earlier that South Korea had considerable losses at home, similarly Turkey and Japan. On the other hand, the United States, they didn't really mind a lot. And of course, the United States are huge, so they can really afford to pay into the pool. So in terms of the absolute transfer, the United States pays by much the largest amount in order to equalize the welfare effects across the coalition. Because the effects overall are not so huge, and Iran is not a key trading partner for most of those countries anyways, the numbers are not huge, right? So even the US in a bad case scenario, they pay like $500 million into the pool. If we look at it in relative terms, South Korea still gets the most, Turkey gets a lot. Japan, for example, is no longer number 3 because they get some millions, but they are huge, so this moves them several positions down. In terms of relative transfers, who is paying most is Malta, right? Because they are the ones that actually gain, so they can really afford to now pay into the pool. But of course, even a large fraction of Malta's GDP is going to be small for everyone else. Therefore, here on the left, in absolute terms, they were not among the top countries. Okay, we do the same exercise once again for Russia. Again, the United States, they are huge, they are far away from Russia, so they're not going to be affected in their welfare very strongly. They can afford to pay a lot into the pool. And when I say a lot, here it actually is a lot, right? So here we are talking about around 3 billion now for the US alone. And then if we look at who gets most, It's Germany, because we saw Germany lost from the sanctions, and Germany is a large economy. Therefore, even a relatively small welfare loss in Germany is expensive to counterbalance. In second place, we have Poland, which in relative terms is hit worse than Germany, but they are smaller, so counterbalancing their loss is not quite as expensive. If we look at relative ones again, the United States, they are no longer number one, because even this large amount they pay, for them, it's relatively small. Norway actually ends up being the one paying the highest price, relatively. Germany moves all the way here to the middle. And then if we look at the countries that in relative terms have to be given a large share of the transfer pool, it's exactly those relatively small Eastern European countries that are close to Russia. Therefore, if they hit Russia with sanctions, this is really going to affect their trade flows. And because they are small in relation to Russia, this is affecting them comparatively strongly. Okay, so this is the pattern. So the logic behind the pattern is very similar as in the Iranian case. Of course, the countries are different ones. Okay, now I took more of your time than I planned to, but Madi said it's okay. So let me nevertheless now come to a conclusion. What we did was we looked at the imposed and the incurred costs of individual members of sanctioned coalitions. We saw that there's this huge heterogeneity. We saw that some of the results, once we do the bootstraps, are actually no longer significant. And we saw, importantly, that acting in the coalition always kind of shifts the costs in the direction we want them. So shifts them down for our domestic costs, shifts them up for the targeted countries' costs. We looked at net transfers for welfare loss equalization and saw which countries would need to kind of pay into the pool. And we think about this a bit in terms of the NATO spending goal, right? So we want to have everyone kind of pay the same relative price, okay? So in NATO, we say everyone pays 2%. In the sanctions, we would say, okay, maybe we don't exactly know what's going to be the price we pay at home, but let's make sure we all pay the same price. And then in the additional exercise, which I did not show, we look at, okay, which countries would further magnify the costs for the sanctioned countries most. Maybe not surprisingly, China is number one in both cases because they are fairly integrated both with Russia and with Iran, and they are huge. And then other BRICS countries are important. In the Russian case, for example, Turkey would be a valuable addition, etc. Okay, that's all I wanted to say. This is not my name, but Julian's name. I forgot to change that, so let me rather put up the first slide instead. Thanks a lot for having me, and I'm looking forward to questions and further discussion.
Thank you very much, Joshua. It was an excellent presentation and an excellent paper. Actually, it dealt with many interesting issues that people who are imposing sanctions and the people who are targeted by sanctions need to know about them. In fact, the structure of trade for each country matters when they want to target a country that is specialized in certain sectors. So let's first see if anyone from the audience has any question, and then so until the ice melts and breaks, and until then I will ask my own questions. Well, it was an interesting point that maybe it's rather a comment than a question. So it's very important that the US unilaterally imposes sanctions on Iran specifically now. So you focus on 2012, where there was international coalition, but now US is imposing sanctions unilaterally, and it also imposes secondary sanctions, which means that if anyone would like to trade with Iran, they will be penalized. So the interesting story is about the carrot and the sticks. So US is now offering only sticks to countries who are dealing with Iran, but maybe in this case that you explained, US could compensate for the losses that the countries are being making for not dealing with Iran anymore. So specifically this point that you showed in the last two figures should be relevant for policymakers in order to tell them how much is the cost if China doesn't want to trade with Iran, if China doesn't have to import oil from Iran, and then you could show that this is the cost and we should compensate them by this much instead of penalizing them for doing trade with Iran. So maybe that's the best solution for unilateral and secondary sanctions, because you didn't bring secondary sanctions, but maybe the discussion could be brought in this way that you noted. Then I didn't understand something, maybe I missed it. So what is the difference between embargo and other sanctions? Aren't they used exchangeably in the literature, or embargo is different thing in your opinion?
Okay. So first of all, I think it's a very interesting point on the secondary sanctions, and we could in fact kind of compare scenarios, right? We could have the US pick between sanctioning countries for not sanctioning Iran or paying them for sanctioning. I think that's very interesting and something that our framework is definitely able to handle. On the second question, so when we say embargo, we mean no trade in that sector whatsoever. So whenever, like for all the results I showed you, except for the one where I said embargo, the trade cost shock we put in was the sectoral trade cost shock that we estimated in the gravity first step. And then for comparison, only in those two tables, the two numbers in each of the tables below, they don't use those estimated trade cost shock. They just say, okay, we're gonna put trade costs to infinity. That's also why those are the only numbers for which there are no standard errors, because there's nothing to bootstrap. You would always draw minus infinity. So there, the only source of uncertainty we're taking into account is the uncertainty in how large is the trade cost shock. And in the embargo case, there is no uncertainty about that. So that's, I was not being clear about that, but that's what we mean with the embargo.
Well, that's interesting, because it would be interesting to see at least the coefficients that you retrieve from the estimations.
Okay,
because, for instance,
I think I have a picture. Wait, I can.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean,
But
what is worrying us is the small estimated effects on gas and oil for Iran, because that was supposed to actually be an embargo, right? So we're looking back into those trade data and we're considering whether we're going to use the point estimates or we're just going to use the definition of an embargo, so infinitely high trade costs in those sectors. Yeah. Otherwise, that's the estimated range, translated it into a tariff equivalent.
For which you use the trade elasticity in addition to the beta coefficients that you get from your estimations, right?
Yeah.
And
that's the ones from Fontanier and co-authors, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, but does it mean that in your, so it means that in the first stage, you should deal with the volume of trade rather than the value of trade, the beta that you're estimating, because then you will get the beta from the volume of trade rather than value, and then put it in the elasticity, which is the import demand elasticity, and then you will return it to a trade or tariff equivalent trade cost. So I think you may need to estimate your first equation using trade volume instead of trade value if you want to estimate tariff equivalent. Or the other option is estimating trade unit value, and your beta coefficient could be simply the tariff equivalent of trade cost. But I mean, this I think it needs some careful thinking, because specifically for oil and gas sector or any sector that are sanctioned, the trade completely drops to the bottom 10%, 5%, meaning that the tariff equivalent is equal to 100% or close to 100%.
So
Maybe
I'm not sure. Maybe the wording with the tariff equivalent is not optimal in terms of like the trade cost shock we feed in. I'm pretty certain that we can infer that based on a value gravity equation. So if we assume we know the thetas, which we will have to assume in the simulation anyways, then from an estimated beta coefficient, we can infer the t hat. So the relative change of the iceberg trade cost, however we want to call that, but that's what we need to feed in. And I'm pretty certain that we can infer that.
okay.
Maybe we should not denote it as a tariff equivalent. That I will have to think about. And then with the oil and gas, I'm with you. I'm worried about how small the effects are that we are estimating. So that's exactly one of the points where we're actually gonna probably produce new numbers. And there is all this discussion about how reliable or unreliable the trade data in these fields are. So we're trying to figure that out. And one alternative would be to say, well, those are embargo sectors, so we're going to hit them with an embargo and not estimate those sectors. We're not quite decided there.
Yeah, sure, definitely. I think it needs more careful thinking. I will send you one paper that it's the seminal paper by Key et al. That they are doing the estimation of tariff equivalent of NTMs, and maybe based on that you can see what they do, and they use import volume instead of import values, but maybe you have a different settings, and that's okay. But maybe, as you said, in addition to trade value and trade volume, maybe the change in sanction, it happens in 2011 and 12, and then suddenly it drops. So what is the period of your analysis?
So the gravity is based on 2000 to 2019. The GE analysis is based on the 2011 version of GTAP. So that we have, like, we're hitting the economy as it was before the sanctions.
But your coefficient is a single coefficient for the whole sample, for all countries. And one thing that comes to my mind is, for instance, I don't know if you control for that the sanction removal after the atom deal with Iran, of course, the sanctions were removed, and maybe in your estimation, it is changed to 0 instead of 1 if it was 1. But then US secondary sanctions did not allow extension of exports of oil to Europe. So maybe that's what is missing in the analysis. I don't know exactly. So maybe that's why the coefficient is not showing the exact sign.
Okay.
So there is one question from Oleg, would you like to unmute and ask the question yourself? So before Oleg, there is also another question by Javier. Javier, could you please unmute and yeah.
Hi, Joshka. Thank you for the presentation.
Hi.
That was very nice. I enjoyed it very much. I have more like a clarification. So in the thetas, you get the theta coefficients for each sector from a paper, or you estimate those thetas, these elasticities?
Yeah, we don't estimate them ourselves.
Okay, so you get the values from a different paper, I guess, right?
Yeah, Fontanier and co-authors.
Okay.
A fairly recent JIE paper.
Okay.
Where they use tariff data because tariff as a price shifter allows you to infer the elasticity directly.
And in the country data, do you also have these domestic trade for each country, or is just international trade? Because maybe that explains why the oil coefficients are so not significant. But it's hard to get the domestic trade at the sectoral level. So
we only use international trade, and I know that.
But maybe the ITPD would be like a robustness check, so because it has domestic trade at the sectoral level, so maybe that's an option. Yeah, great. Thank you very much.
Yoto would for sure agree with that. Yes.
Yeah. All right. Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks. Very good.
Thanks.
So maybe, so I don't see Oleg. So Oleg writes, okay, I understand Oleg. So an interesting counterfactual exercise could be an assessment of the incentives for the country, not only avoiding to join the sanctions, but on the contrary, to provide opportunity to bypass the sanctions. To itself, for example, as Turkey does for Russia now, which may also help explain the reluctance to join the sanctions for some countries. Is it possible to evaluate that as well in your model? So my understanding from this comment is like China is right now buying oil from Russia, and China is not willing to join the coalition because Russia is buying for lower price and it's benefiting China. So is there any way to evaluate that as well?
To a certain extent, for sure, because what our simulation would say for the coalition that actually took place, what that means for China is China gains a little bit, right? Exactly, because if Russia is moved away from Europe, let's say, it makes Russia comparatively closer to other countries, and those countries can gain from it. So by kind of simple general equilibrium mechanics, China is going to gain. And then, of course, if you compare China within the coalition, you have to compare it to the case where the coalition is still doing what they're doing and China is out, because this actually makes China better off. China, part of the coalition, makes them worse off in comparison to like business as usual. So from coalition being in place and China being in the coalition, the drop is a little further. That's something that we can for sure quantify. Now, part, I think, of what we think about in this respect is that countries kind of specifically open up to the sanctioned country, right? So they don't only gain via some kind of general equilibrium mechanism, but they kind of try to liberalize towards those countries, kind of bring down their trade costs in order to gain from them being sanctioned and moving away from the rest. That's something that is hard to quantify exactly because of the GE channels. We could, the moment we know which set of countries we want to allow this to do, kind of like if you tell me it's China, Turkey, and Kazakhstan, then I can say, okay, for those three, I can test whether I actually see evidence that they expanded their trade beyond what we would expect based on general equilibrium adjustments. But if we don't know which countries, we cannot allow it for all outsiders, because this is then captured by multilateral resistance. So that's kind of the trade-off we have. We did that in the firm level paper that Madi briefly mentioned earlier. We exactly kind of looked at whether there's evidence that, say, neighboring countries have suspicious trade patterns with the sanctioned country. So there's increases beyond GE, and then this would go in the same direction. If that's an assumption we're willing to make, that it's only the neighbors, or it's only China, like you have to make some assumption on who the set of countries can be.
Excellent. Then you had one interesting methodology, because I'm aware that it's not possible to do bootstrapping when we have multiple fixed effects, right? So the way that you did your fixed effect, you programmed it yourself, right? Or is it within Stata code that you used, or is it, as you explained, you change one observation and then you estimate, you get the result, and then change another observation, right? How does it work exactly? I want to know.
Okay, yeah, so it's hand built at this point. I mean, at this point, I hope we will kind of put that into a wrapper and make it available. So far, it's a hand built procedure, which, I mean, in principle, yeah, you just, what you need is a command with which you can do the like one-step PPML estimation fairly fast. So we do it in R using our own GLM HDFE package. And then you resample. And the way we're used to think about a bootstrap is you take random draws from the observations, and then you put them back and you take them again. And that has exactly this problem that you're kind of changing the structure, right? Which in a fixed effect setting can or cannot be a problem. And the Bayesian bootstrap has this kind of intuitive interpretation that you're doing kind of the same thing. And in expectation, in both cases, your weight as one observation is 1/n. So in expectation, it's very similar. But then it's not like there's a lot of zero weights and then a 1, a 2, a 3, a 4, and a 5 weight, but all the weights lie between 0 and 1. So we're not actually dropping any, we're just reweighting. And therefore the structure stays the same. You're just kind of scaling up some country pairs and scaling down on the other country pairs, and look at whether this changes things a lot.
Excellent. So soon you will publish also this package, right? The program.
I hope so. I hope so.
Okay.
But I have to admit the lead figure on the implementation of that was
Michael Pfeffermeyer.
Julian. Pardon?
Okay. So because Michael Pfeffermeyer had also a similar thing a few years ago. Is it similar to that?
Yeah. Yeah, he did not do the Bayesian, but like a traditional bootstrap.
Okay.
And as far as I'm aware, he only did it in the cross section so far. Not in the panel. But sure, I mean, it's exactly one of the papers where we got the idea from. Michael has all these arguments on why the standard errors are problematic. Now we have Whitener-Zilkin saying it in the three-way setting, and they do an analytical correction. And we're not saying that's not something you should do. We're just offering an alternative to their analytical correction.
Interesting. And one final note. Well, I asked this question earlier that you were estimating by sectors instead of estimating everything together. And as you explained, because you don't have origin destination time, it could even work. But I have another thing in mind so the effect of sanction on each target country could be different from another. So what you have as beta is the average effect across all economies. So why not interacting it with exporting or importing dummies that you know exactly how much Iran sanctions on Iran affects it. So beta could be country specific, and it's not difficult. I don't know if it also works with your bootstrapping, but interacting it with country dummies who are target of sanctions, we could see a different thing. So here, this graph that you're showing, the difference comes from the difference in trade elasticity, right? Because the coefficient of sanction that you estimate beta, it's the same across all. So maybe you don't need to use these trade elasticities that are country specific, but you can simply interact your beta with country dummies.
I mean, those you see right now, the heterogeneity comes from the trade elasticities and from sector-specific beta. So they are sector-specific.
Right.
But then if you move to like all of these, all the GE effects, the country level differences in general equilibrium, they come from like how am I integrated with Russia? How am I integrated with Iran? And not from me putting in place stricter sanctions than you. That's absolutely right. And you are right that we could identify them country by country, like technically. And I mean, probably would slow things down because there are quite a few. And in the bootstrap that, I mean, might take some time, but I'm pretty sure it would not be too much time. The one problem you get is that the variation you're using becomes very limited, right? It's kind of similar to this Bayar-Yotov-Silkin type of RTA estimates where they get finer and finer and finer. First one RTA, then for each RTA, then for each RTA country pair, and then for each RTA country pair direction. And once you move into the finest one, the range becomes extremely large of estimates, because then ultimately you're only identifying based on the variation in the one time series, right?
Exactly, and that's what we need.
If anything else is happening between those countries and Iran or Russia at that point in time beyond the sanctions, it's going to be fully picked up by the country specific effect, right? While with our kind of average effect, we're still kind of successfully cancel out some of the noise. I think that's the trade-off. But I agree that it's interesting. I'm a little afraid that we would get some numbers that are maybe a little too extreme to actually be believed, because they come from kind of time series variation only.
Well, I think if you do that, maybe even the estimated cost would be even much larger for Iran than Russia, because Iran's economy was affected badly since 2012 up to now. So the real GDP is dropped in the past 10 years, 1 decade, and it's sincerely because of that, and also the continuation of the secondary sanctions by the US. So that's why even the country-specific effect of sanction is different. So what you get is the average effect, and I agree that there will be some noises, but we need to see some harsher effect in your estimations at the end, but we don't see that. So Iran has, you showed 13% in the full embargo, in the coalition, which I think should be much stronger than Russian case, which is 14%. Yeah.
Okay, but that, like, to be clear, this number here,
this
it's not gonna change with the estimation at all, right? Because it's global and embargo. So that's kind of just, if for the point in time we look at, if we take a Caliendo-Paro type of Ricardian IO sexual trade model, that's the cost of moving Iran to autarky.
Yes, but then the 2.35% that is coming from the estimate, it's too little, you know?
Okay, yeah. That, I mean, that's something exactly
Yeah.
that is going to change if we change the estimation procedure for sure. So the fraction of the potential that is realized, that depends on what we estimate. The maximum potential, if you say that's too small, you're saying Caliente Paro is the wrong model. Or
Okay.
like we need to adjust elasticities in Caliente Paro or something like that. But it's not due to our first stage estimation. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, but I see your point.
Yeah. Okay. Any other questions, comments from the audience? Yeah, I think it was a very good work, and it needs to be actually promoted more because many more people need to know about this, about the details. And I'm very happy that you presented it at our seminars in international economics. Thank you for doing this. And yeah, good luck with the publication of this paper in a good journal. And thanks everyone also for attending this seminar. We hope that we will continue these seminars next month in February. We have, I think, 2 seminars. So looking forward to seeing you again. Thank you, Yoshka. Any final words, comments?
Thank you very much. Yeah, I enjoyed it a lot to be here, and I'm looking forward to maybe seeing some of the Vienna crowd at the FIW conference coming up soon in Vienna.
Thank you. Hopefully, yeah. See you in Vienna then.
Thank you.
Have a nice evening. Ciao.
Bye.